Hi, I'm Eli, and I'm here at Alluvium. We're going to have our Sunday service in just a little while. But I wanted to talk about a question that I think has been polluted and not well addressed, and at its baseline, in an a priori sense, is a very, I think, intellectually interesting and spiritually fulfilling question to ask. And the question that we're going to ask is there a God? Now, right off the bat, I want to ask you to please have a critical but open mind. Some of the things that I'm going to say are going to sound kind of radical if you've not heard them before, if you're hearing them for the first time. I also know that there are a great many of you who already have some religious ideas, and you're already in a religion, and your minds are probably going to turn off right away when I start talking about God or spirituality or an animus to the universe. So I understand that. And then I also know that there are many of you out there who are probably atheists who don't believe in any idea that there's anything more to the universe than just the facts, the figures, the numbers, the objects, the laws that make the universe what it is. And to many of you out there, when you hear the word like church or religion, your minds sort of turn off automatically. And I very much understand that. But if you're sort of like me and you're sort of in the middle and you don't think that there's a good solid answer to that question yet, I hope you'll find this video and this discussion to be something nourishing. So right off the bat, I do want to thank Kevin. He's filming right now, and he may be asking me some questions and helping me to stay focused and also to direct the conversation. So thanks very much, Kevin, for filming. And you may hear his voice. If he asks any questions, I'll repeat them just so that they're heard, probably. All right, so is there a God? So I think right off the bat, it kind of depends on how you define the question as to whether or not you'll come up with an answer that's interesting or nourishing. If your answer is already right off the bat, I know that there's a God, and I think there's an anthropomorphic entity, that looks like a person that is making all the decisions for the universe on a daily basis. And yet, I can't talk with this entity and I don't know what it wants. Then I think right off the bat, there's sort of like, not to say that that's not true, but that's sort of a less fulfilling, less intellectually nourishing way to ask the question. If you think of God as maybe a cosmic watchmaker that set the universe in motion and then stepped away from it and can't interact with us, that's also maybe a little less intellectually fulfilling of a way to conceptualize the question. But it's still interesting to sort of ask questions about that scenario. Why did that God create the universe? Why did God put the universe into motion if there indeed is a God? And I think so, if you delve into some of those aspects of that conceptualization, it can, again, become an interesting question. I want to right off the bat sort of acknowledge that there are a lot of very fervent and emotional ideas about religion and about God that have made this a much less intellectual exercise to even ask the question. But I think, and I hope I'll have all of you appreciate, that there are ways to define the question and ways to thoughtfully and intellectually answer the question by using scientific insights, by using some interesting ideas that have emerged just this century, and in some cases in just the last few decades, to sort of have a more fulfilling way to address this question and to have a better framework for addressing it. So I think the most fulfilling way to answer the question, and the way that sort of makes it the most binary and the easiest to address, is by thinking of the question of, is there a God, as, is there an animus to the universe? Is there a spirit behind the universe? Another way to ask that question is the universe just the sum total of its parts? Or is it somehow more than that sum total? Is it perhaps the ghosts in the machine that if you look at the framework of it and you look at the very physical realities of it, that you come up with one answer, but then the real answer is that you can take something more holistic and make some assertions about that more holistic side of things. And I think another useful way to formulate the question is to ask, is there purposefulness to the universe? Is there will to the universe? Was there any reason why it was here? Now, I think there are some interesting insights that have emerged from the sciences that can help us to sort of conceptualize the answers and sort of narrow down on at least some interesting points of discussion. And so one of those ideas is that part of the answer of why the universe is here is tied up in what the universe's history is and what its future is. And in those regards, in the regards of the cosmogony, the origin of the universe, and the eschatology of the universe, its ultimate fate, science has actually maybe not come down on an answer, but certainly we're sort of honing in on one gradually over time. So I want to give Kevin an opportunity to ask a question as I'm going through this talk. So I'm going to turn it over to Kevin really quick and just hear what his question is.
What are your opinions of the individual soul?
That's a really excellent question. Now, we do want to address that in a different full video. Do humans have a soul? But in some ways, the question of is there a God in the universe is very, very, very analogous in the way I think of it as to the question of is there a soul inside a human, right? And there are similarly different ways to conceptualize the answer to that question. And I think the most interesting and nourishing and the way that we're going to get some answers is by conceptualize the question of is there a soul as is there more than, more to being a human than the sum total of our parts? So are we just the sum total of our cells, our neurons, our ligaments, our hepatocytes? Or when you put that all together, is there something more than what the sum of all those organs is? And you can answer that in a couple of ways. Number one, you could say, well, we're more than the sum total because if you look at everything holistically, it's certainly a very different entity than if you laid all the parts end to end. I think that's one answer. I think another answer is to say that, yes, when you put it all together, there is this thing that we at least conceptualize of as an identity, a spirit, a soul that becomes more than that. And I think there's a third way to answer the question that we can kind of think of it is there a ghost in the machine? The phraseology, ghost in the machine, was, I think Albert Ryle was the philosopher who came up with that phraseology. And my understanding is that he used it as an argument against the Cartesian formulation, René Descartes' formulation of mind-body dualism. René Descartes, of course, had the idea that we are bodies, and on top of that, we are minds, and the two entities are separate, and both can exist at the same time. So the fact that they exist together is just an interesting aside. But anyways, I think that's a very interesting question. Do humans have a soul? We are going to tackle it in a separate video, but it's a very important conversation. It's an important question to address at this juncture, because it's very analogous to the way that we're going to address the question of is there a God in the universe? Meaning, is the universe more than the sum of its parts? Is there something that holistically gives the universe a separate meaning than its component parts? Or is there a ghost in the machine for the universe as well? Meaning, is there a spirit? Is there an animus to the universe? So, very good question, and it certainly is relevant to ask it at that juncture. We're going to address it more thoroughly later, but it is a nice analogy for how we're going to think about the universe. All right, so let's talk now about scientific insights into whether or not there is a God. I think there are a lot of lines of thinking and a lot of lines of evidence-based proof that sort of indicate that there could be an answer to that question and that it's interesting to think of the answer. So we talked earlier about the religious notion of God as anthropomorphic. I'm going to repudiate that, and the reason why I don't like the religious notion of God is because, by analogy, let's think of Graham's number. Okay, so up until 2007, Graham's number had the world's record for being the largest number that was ever used in a mathematical proof. And it's so large, in fact, that if you tried to think of it, your brain would literally turn into a black hole. There's so many digits to Graham's number that there's not even a meaningful way to write it out in the time span and the space of the universe. So the information density to get all those digits inside the spatial dimensions of your head are so dense that your brain, if it thought of Graham's number, would turn into a black hole. So that's not even an exaggeration. Graham's number would literally make your head turn into a black hole. So the point is, if you try to look at the universe and anthropomorphize it in a way that you yourself can understand it, I think you're really diminishing the vastness of the universe and the vastness of reality. If we're already sort of encountering numbers in mathematical proofs that are so big that they make our heads turn into a black hole, then why try to take human characteristics and superimpose that onto God? Okay, so we've talked about sort of the religious answers to the questions, why I don't think they're particularly nourishing. And then there's another reason why sort of I don't like sort of the religious answers to the question, because there's a certain degree to which you have to take those questions on faith, rather than thinking about them as questions that you could answer through intelligence, through intellect, through discourse, and through discussion. So, for instance, I would analogize the traditional religious idea of whether or not there's a God by saying, like, is there a teapot rotating around Pluto? Okay, maybe there's a teapot in orbit around Pluto, but if it doesn't matter to our lives, then what difference does it make? We should just try and be good people and live the best lives we can. And it doesn't really make it intellectually interesting or nourishing to say, no, you have to have faith that there's a teapot orbiting Pluto. You can't sort of answer that question intellectually. All right, so we've talked about some of the religious answers to the question of, is there a God? And I hope we've at least scratched the surface in some ways that are satisfying. Now let's talk about the scientific insights into the question of whether there's a God. And as we turn to the scientific component of how we can answer this question, I think it's useful to sort of sum up that what we're really asking is there animus to the universe? Is there a spirit or a soul to the universe? Is the universe more than the sum of its parts? And we should also answer the question, why is it important? I myself am an editor of a medical journal. So the first thing I get whenever I see a paper is I ask myself, why is this paper important? Does it contribute meaningfully to our understanding? So I want to circle back to Kevin and see if he has any questions at this point and kind of ask if he wants to help me stay on focus as well. Any other questions, Kevin?
Yes. As far as the universe goes, do you think if there was a God, he created like multiple universes or just ours?
That's a very insightful question, and I think science is starting to have an answer to that question. One of the scientific lines of thinking that helps us to answer whether or not there is a God kind of addresses that specifically. And that is the scientific literature that's very meaningful and very insightful and very interesting to read, and I think very intellectually nourishing, that the universe may be a simulation. What are the arguments why it might be a simulation? There's kind of three different arguments as to why the universe might be a simulation that I could easily recap. And there's a lot of other thinkers who have done more work on this. But one of the answers gets to Kevin's question, which is the anthropic principle. So if you look at the universe, you can sort of look at it and say, well, it's a really fine tune towards the creation of life, right? And so the traditional scientific answer to that invokes the fallacy of the anthropic principle. And that is to say that basically the universe seems fine-tuned towards the existence of life because there's so many universes. And so in order to get just the right balance of cosmological equations and constants that creates fertile ground for life and for intelligent life, you have to create many, many universes, and then eventually one of those universes will be favorable enough for humankind to form. It's really interesting to think that the Big Bang happened with just the right density of matter to create humankind. If there had been even a quadrillionth of 1% less density in the Big Bang, then it would have been too dense for stars and galaxies to form, and when the Big Bang occurred, all matter would have been thrown out into all directions forever without any opportunity for galaxies and stars to coalesce. If the Big Bang singularity had been 1/4 more dense, then it would have actually coalesced into black holes, and galaxies never would have had the chance to form. So the answer, I think, to Kevin's question is one possibility is that you have to make bazillions of universes, countless numbers of universes, in order to have one where the percentages in the cosmological constants turn out just right. But that has also been invoked in one of the ideas that the universe is a simulation, right? Because if the universe is a simulation, then there was some design, I hate to use the phraseology intelligent design behind it, but you don't have to worry about the anthropic principle anymore, right? Because something actually fine-tuned the universe to create intelligent life. So that's one of the arguments why the universe might be a simulation, which I think is a really interesting conceptualization to answering whether or not there's a God. Another reason why the universe might be a simulation is found in quantum mechanics. There are, if you've delved into quantum mechanics at all, you'll find the more you learn about it, the less sense it makes. In fact, famously, Richard Feynman, who was one of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics, once said that if you understand quantum mechanics, then you don't understand quantum mechanics. So one of the ideas is that the quantum realm, the realm of things that become so small that the laws of reality start to break down, is actually because what we're getting to is we're getting to the resolution of the simulation that we exist in. And some of the inherent contradictions between relativistic physics and quantum mechanics are contradictions because what we're uncovering is the inherent suboptimal resolution of the actual matrix of this simulation that we're living in. So that's an interesting idea too. That's another argument as to why reality might be a simulation. And then the third argument why reality might be a simulation, which I think gets to one scientific answer as to whether or not there's a God, is that we ourselves create simulacra, right? So the further humans go, the better our simulations get. And if you just look at video games over the last, 50 years, if you look at earlier games like Pong, and then you look at really advanced computer games, and maybe I'll ask Kevin for an example of what's an advanced computer game that.
No Man's Sky.
No Man's Sky. There you go. They really have such impressive resolution, and all of the NPCs, right, the non-playable characters, right, NPCs, are becoming much, much, much more advanced, and you're able to have different interactions with them. They're able to say different things. So if you kind of project that that progress, the kind of Moore's law, logarithmic exponential progress that video games have had in creating simulations, you can easily imagine that if humanity gets another 300 years, we could create the kind of simulations that would be just as convincing as the universe is to us. So that's another interesting argument for why the universe might be a simulation. So I think in that regard, science is at least converging upon developing insights to the question, is there a God? And it's a question that I think is nourishing and intellectually enriching to ask, and so it's a question that we shouldn't shy away from. I want to get to some other answers that science, or some other insights that science has given us into the question, is there a God? But first, I want to give Kevin another chance to ask me a question, help steer me in the right direction, and help me to get a little further on in this thought process.
All right, in that case, when we eventually become our own gods and you're able to download a template of your brain into probably a software or some kind of simulation itself, do you think that negates the importance of a soul, or do you think that just keeps us going on forward?
That is a really interesting question, and I think I looked recently into some research that a Google programmer made, and I don't remember the name of the programmer, but he had a paper that he put out in the 2010s that predicted that within about 40, 50 years, we'll be able to create a template of the brain. And certainly MRI scans, we're actually approaching the resolution on an MRI where we could actually make a structural replication of the brain. And that's actually probably another reason why it's likely that the universe could be a simulation, because we're getting to the point that we can simulate our brains, and the next step, which would be very easy, is put our brains into an artificial environment. It's interesting to think how quickly we'll think when our brains are digitized, because then there will be a lot of things that will basically think millions of times faster than our biological brains are capable of thinking. And it'll be an interesting existence to live in. So if you could kind of imagine if you created a replicate of the human brain and you put that replicate into a machine and then you just kind of let the machine go off into the real world, it would be a very unsatisfying existence for that brain, right? Because that brain's going to be super frustrated with how slow everything is in the real world. But I think we've actually recently, in the last year or two, mapped a rat's brain on the cell-to-cell, neuron-to-neuron level. So we're actually getting to the point that we can sort of look at a mammal's brain and map every single neuron in it. And we're not that far off from being able to do that with a human's brain and be able to map each and every neuron. And I think it's about 50 years. And at that point, we'll be able to create artificial environments, and we'll need to probably create artificial environments for digitized entities that will be new concepts of reality. And that's an argument that maybe this universe is created by something. And so these are not necessarily like religious, fanatical, or reactionary statements to me. These statements are statements that I think are emerging from scientific insights and scientific lines of thought. The last thing that I want to say, then I'll give Kevin the chance to ask maybe a couple of summary questions after I'm done saying this. Well, you don't have to, though, also. But the last thing that I want to say is there are other ways that I think science is converging on interesting, intellectually nourishing answers to the question of, is there a purpose to the universe? I think one of the things that's sort of inextricably woven into the question of, is there a will, is there a purpose to the universe, is where did the universe come from and what is its ultimate fate? There are two models of where the universe might have come from that are both sort of scientifically accepted as possible models. One is the Big Bang theory that we're all quite familiar with. It does have a couple of holes, like the inflationary cosmological model of the Big Bang is kind of something that helps the math to work out, but there's not a good reason to think of why the inflationary period existed. Another problem with the Big Bang is it gives rise to this asymmetry of matter and antimatter. Theoretically, if the Big Bang happened the way we think it happened, it should have given rise to equal amounts of matter and antimatter. And so the question often arises when people ask questions about paradoxes in the Big Bang, where's all the antimatter? But science is definitely not back to that point of what did the universe look like in its first initial instant and before that. We're definitely not to that point. But if you think of the progress that we've made in terms of looking backwards in time and history, which comes from looking with our telescopes out to the sky at quasars that exist in the far distant realms of the universe, those quasars are also a mirror back to the early times of what the universe looked like at a very early age, because as we look out in space, we're also looking backwards in time as the speed of light carries information to us from older and older time periods. So I think we are getting more and more insights into where the universe came from, and maybe that won't offer us a complete picture of why the universe is here, but I think as we get to look back and resolve that initial picture of what the universe was at its singularity before the Big Bang occurred and at the moment that the Big Bang occurred, we'll start getting more insights into not just the how the universe happened, but the why it happened. Certainly, Lawrence Krauss and Stephen Hawking have a lot of things to say about how you can get a universe from a quantum fluctuation, so you can get a universe from nothing. We know, by looking at the quantum realm, that particles inherently pop in and out of existence, and so therefore, if the universe was initially a vacuum and nothing existed, a quantum particle could have come into existence as just a quantum fluctuation, and that could have given rise to the universe. So there are guesses as to what might have happened initially in the universe, and those guesses are maybe not complete answers, but we're starting to get some insights. Now let's bring this back to Alluvium and why we're here. I think one of the important goals of Alluvium is to maybe not come up with the answers to these questions in a way that's very, very comprehensive, but it's to get people excited about asking the questions. So if we start answering the questions, what is the will of the universe? Does the universe even have will? then we start getting to the questions of why are we here in the first place? And I think that's kind of the deepest and most meaningful question of all. And one of the reasons and one of the goals of these weekly messages that I have is to get people excited about asking those questions and asking them in a way that's intellectually nourishing and it's a way that's interesting to think about. And our other goal, finally, is to think about what scientific insights tell us about these questions, to think about those insights, and then reflect them back on ourselves as philosophical beings. So that's a bit of a summary of some of the things that I've mentioned. Kevin, do you want to ask any other follow-up questions or ask any other questions about anything that I've said?
No, I feel fulfilled and enlightened.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Thanks, Kevin, for filming and setting this up. Thanks very much for tuning in. And I'll keep giving weekly messages, but I wanted to give you some insights onto the question, is there a God? And I hope you were at least stimulated to learn more about that question, to learn more about what its answers might possibly be, and to also learn, to also be excited about asking the question and getting closer towards an answer. And I hope some of you will come to Alluvium tonight and on other nights to join us for more discussions just like this one. Thanks very much for tuning in. Thanks, Kevin, for filming.
You know, I can make a